Everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Whaling Museum for our workshop about building material reuse and architectural salvage. I know we have a couple of people online and a couple of people trying to park, but in the interest of trying to keep everything on track, we're going to start now. My name is Mary Bergman, and I'm the executive director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust. And I'm just really grateful to welcome you here and grateful for the thanks of the support of Remain Nantucket. And I'm going to turn it over to Virna Gonzalez right now to come on up and just say a few words of thanks as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm shorter than Mary. I'm shorter than Mary, so I got to move this a little bit. So it's nice to see everyone here today. Thank you for coming. I am Virna Gonzalez. I am the project and marketing manager for Remain Nantucket, and I wanted to welcome you here today. It's exciting to see everybody here in one place talking about a really important subject. And I want to extend my thanks to Mary. Mary, thank you, and to your team at Nantucket Preservation Trust for getting us together this far in the community conversation around salvage and reuse, and for gathering us together today. Thank you for your leadership. And I'd like to extend my thanks to our friends at the town of Nantucket and the Builders Association that are here today for their partnership and their work. Thank you also to the speakers for your time to visit us and enlighten us through your experience and your knowledge. And my gracious thanks to everyone here, the attendees, for coming to listen, to showing that you care, and for your participation. Being regenerative has always been a part of our history on Nantucket, and what a pivotal time it is to concentrate our efforts towards solving salvage and reuse issues to support our overwhelmed waste stream and our overwhelmed environment, and to ease affordable housing efforts. Our mission at Remain is to bring creative thinking to the environment and community challenges, to elevate local industry and encourage innovation and resilience across the island. This is precisely what you're doing here today, bringing your mind, your openness, your conversation to explore solutions. And it's very exciting to witness. Creative thinking is certainly a theme that's been circulating around Nantucket for some time now. We look to each other in the community to find something of value that can be passed along and reused. We even use Facebook for good and not evil to post these materials of value so they can be reused. And now, in this big picture thinking of systemic solutions, so many good thoughts are circulating, from creating furniture and home goods to renovation efforts, creating supply shops, transforming materials into artistic crafts. And yes, a large facility would be really nice to circulate building materials. Honestly, there's never one solution to any one problem. All of them have a ripple effect towards positive change. It's good to keep in mind when we have these sessions, and everyone's thoughts are valuable and helpful in this room. So on behalf of my team at Remain, I'd like to express our excitement for what the community will create and accomplish together as we move forward to take these steps. Good luck and thank you today. And if I may, one other thing, I wanted to acknowledge Greg Maringer, if he's in the room. Greg, are you here? Okay, so Greg Maringer, I just want to thank you and your friends and your colleagues who's been salvaging and reusing building materials for decades. He's still doing it. He's gone underground and independent this whole time, and because he felt it was the right thing to do. He's rescued and repurposed materials on the island. He's also created tiny homes out on the Cape to help homeless veterans. And he's an unsung hero of salvage, and I just wanted to offer my thanks to you, Greg, after all these years, making this quiet and relentless passion come to life. All right, thank you.
Ooh. Thanks, Virna. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everybody. That was a beautiful introduction and kind of give you an idea of where we are and why we're all here. Holly Backus will be joining me on the stage shortly. I just want to tell you a little bit about who Holly is, if you don't know. I think most people in here probably do, but this being recorded, so just in case somebody watches this from somewhere else. Holly Backus is the town's preservation planner. She's been a land use planner for more than 15 years. In 2019, she was promoted as the first preservation planner for the town of Nantucket, and she's the town's local hazard mitigation plan coordinator and successfully managed the project to update the plan for FEMA approval in March 2019. She's involved with the town's resiliency and sustainability planning efforts, and she is the staff liaison to both the Nantucket Historic District Commission, the Nantucket Historical Commission, and occasionally participates on the town's Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, among many other things. Holly is a great friend and a great preservationist, and I'm happy to have her come up here and present a little bit with me about the history of salvage on Nantucket.
Thank you, Mary.
Who's heard this quote before? Nantucket, take out your map and look at it. The Melville quote, here we are standing under the whale. I thought Holly could give us a little bit of a background about, how Nantucket came to be this historic island.
So many of you know that Nantucket has been a local district since 1955, one of the first in the country. 1966, Then in 1966, we became one of the first National Historic Landmark districts. But it wasn't really until some catalyst within, building construction on Nantucket that we really wanted to have local control. So in 1971, 72-ish, along at the same time that Nantucket basically created zoning, we also became an entire local district. So there's no donut holes within our jurisdiction. And I'm also happy to say that in 2021, Nantucket became, I think, the 27th community within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to be a certified local government with the National Park Service. Actually, something near and dear to my heart since I was a teenager. Why was Nantucket not a CLG? So now we are, and that really shows Nantucket wanting to have historic preservation as part of our local planning efforts. Very, very happy. And that allows us to survey our cultural historic resources. But can't acknowledge preservation on Nantucket without mentioning basically Everett Crosby's 95% perfect. That was the catalyst of the preservation movement on Nantucket.
So talking about talking about historic preservation, talking about salvage and reuse is something Holly and I talk about all the time, which is this isn't anything new. We're not thinking about reinventing the wheel here. There's a lot of shipwrecks around Nantucket. How many people have been to the Shipwreck and Life-Saving Museum? Yeah. That is why we have so many lighthouses or shifting shoals, unfortunately resulted in many shipwrecks. Interestingly enough to note that many of these shipwrecks were sold at auction. Nantucketers were thrifty bunch. They reused pretty much everything. The Warren Sawyer, that shipwreck that was found last December again, that the eroding Myacomet Beach was revealed. That shipwreck sold at auction in 1885 for $19. I guess the guy didn't pick it up because a lot of it is still there. But shipwrecks were things that it was all about making use of what was available.
There's also plenty of places on Nantucket, especially like Quidnet, where we know ships were actually utilized, dragged off the beach and used in part of these houses, something that is part of our cultural identity.
Being here at the Whaling Museum, got to pull out some Moby Dick quotes. And even in Moby Dick and Herman Melville's Moby Dick, talking about the Nantucketers carrying around pieces of wood like pieces of the true cross. This idea of an island that's so far out to sea, there's not a lot of, the island was deforested pretty early on. You go out to Sconset. That's the next picture, yeah. You see Sans Souci, a house here. Has anybody seen this house out in Sconset on Shell Street, Center Street? Should really know this, huh? I give the tour. But it's built out of pieces of shipwreck. Bricks that were from the British ship Queen were scavenged by the people who were living here to build the chimney.
And in addition to salvaging these structures, we've been moving them for about 270 plus years, something that if you go to any HDC meeting, you're going to hear me say on a weekly basis. And anecdotally, I was actually provided some family history as a Nantucket native, multiple generations, and married another Nantucket native. My grandmother-in-law told me that in 1959, part of their house that they had was actually deconstructed completely, and then part of it was made and built a new structure on West York Street, as well as some of the verge board that were on that Victorian type structure was actually put to another structure on North Water Street. Again, part of what we have been doing is with revitalizing our structures.
I went through the paper and I was looking at a couple examples of historic salvage, and one was in 1947 when Albert Egan Sr. removed the Hiltz property adjacent to the Sconset Inn. The structure was taken down with care in order to salvage as much of the material as possible for the new cottages. And those are the Moby Dick Inn cottages out by the summer house cottages. In 1957, there was a bell tower down by Brant Point that as much was salvaged that could be saved when it was just taken down. In 1964, there's plenty of mentions throughout of names that you'll recognize throughout the paper of people salvaging as much as they could. The 106-room Seacliff Inn in 1972, 50 years ago, was taken down by Augie Ramos and Manuel Roberts. I thought it was very interesting to read that plans to drop the debris and broken wood over an embankment in the rear of the building where it would have been buried have been changed, and instead the lumber and materials such as the bricks, windows, and doors be taken to a property owned by Ramus. And all of that material was reused, and it's probably in all sorts of buildings around the island. And I think this was an inn that was built in 1857 and 1972. People stopped and thought and made sure that things were reused, and something that is really part of Nantucket's cultural identity, as is house moving, as Holly mentioned. We move more houses than pretty much any other town in the country. I think Academy Hill is a really great example of adaptive reuse. The Dreamland movie theater that had been a Hicksite Quaker building on Main Street that was part of the Nantucket Hotel down by Brant Point, also called the Hotel Driftwood. But that actually ended up proving too true, so they changed the name to the Hotel Nantucket. And then another great example of salvage and reuse, maybe Holly will tell us a little bit about this facade here.
I remember this well. I was an intern with Nantucket Preservation Trust, and I was in my first year in college. The facade came from the circa 1875 James B. Coffin grocery store right there on Main Street. It was also a retail store, a laundromat, and many different uses over the years, but it was demolished in August of 2001, excuse me. Wow, so long ago. And a lot of preservationists were really, really upset about this, but one fortunate aspect of it is the fact that it was saved and it was restored and utilized onto its sister building that Matt Fee and his family own. And one thing I'd like to just acknowledge is the fact that Nantucket Preservation Trust has a perpetual preservation restriction on that property. So in my eyes, that's a win-win, definitely. That Italianate facade will definitely be there for years to come.
Yeah, there were 6 women who stood outside the building, and when some were almost arrested, some I know signed up for this event. I don't know if they're here with us today, but we're grateful for them. And as we talk about, one of the things I think you'll hear today, which might be surprising, is this idea that sometimes a building does reach the end of its life cycle. Preservation is about knowing that you can't necessarily save everything. And it's about saving the things that you can and documenting the things that you can't. There are a lot of buildings in threatened areas along Nantucket that are going to be moved or removed. And thinking about documentation is really important. These are some historic photos from the Nantucket Historical Association's archives. These are 2 of my favorite pictures, in part because that house that I guess it's the very tall house. That's not something you'd build today. I can hear John McLaughlin saying that. It's not something we'd allow to be built today. But this idea that back when these pictures were taken, somebody documented that these houses were here. You can see in the handwriting on it all gone. Now, Holly would like to see better documentation than that for a building that's going to come down from the HDC. But, we can't save what we don't know is there. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the survey work?
Yeah, so now that we're a certified local government, we've been able to apply for federal funding from Congress. Each state historic preservation office is required to give 10% of their federal funding to CLGs, and we've been able to create a survey plan for the entire island. It's going to take about a decade, but I'm hoping with our public and private partnerships we can survey it all quicker than that. That would include not only the Nantucket Preservation Trust and the efforts that they do, but also the University of Florida's Preservation Institute Nantucket. And I cannot mention them without saying I'm also an alumni of them. Glad to be a Penn student. And this effort is basically updating our cultural historic resource survey. So those old HDC surveys that you see that were done in the 80s, 88, 80, and 89, we really have unfortunately been deficient in updating them. So this effort allows us to do that a little bit at a time because documentation is important even if something is lost or moved.
We're wrapping up here our part of the presentation, but just a reminder, I know we've talked about some of these things in the 1820s, 1840s, 1950s, but this is our recent history as well. Here's a story in the New York Times about the Take It or Leave It. Who's been to the Take It or Leave It this week? Yeah, okay. So we're pretty, thrifty here where you use things. This is actually a whole story about Ole Lokenskaard's house on 3 Darrymore Road, which he built pretty much entirely out of findings from the dump. And just a reminder that, again, this is our past and is going to be part of our future.
And to quote an NHA historian, Mr. Stackpole, Nantucket can generate its future by holding firm to its past. And reusing these structures will allow us to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Our next speaker, I just want to make a note, too, to say that our food and drinks are very nearly set up. We got a little held up, I think, because of the filming that's going to go on Main Street and some of those other commercial streets tomorrow. But the food is here. It's just about all set up. So please, after Vince speaks, I think we're going to have a short break. That's right. So a chance to get some food and drink from Bartlett's. Let me see. Here we go. Vince Murphy is the Sustainable Programs Manager for the town of Nantucket. He's a former environmental consultant, has a Master's of Science in Ecosystem Conservation and Landscape Management from the University College Cork, Ireland, and is now a proud Irish American. He has lived in several parts of Europe and North America, including Ireland, the UK, Netherlands, Finland, and Arizona. Very foreign, before settling on Nantucket with his family. So Vince has worked as an environmental consultant in Ireland. He was most recently the Coastal Resilience Coordinator for the town of Nantucket and is now excitedly in his new role. And we're really looking forward to hearing what Vince has to say about how the salvage and reuse fits into the town's goals for sustainability. Come on up.
Now then, the standard volume check. Is that all right? Makes sense to everybody? Great. So I'm going to try and talk through some of the ideas of how salvage and material reuse and deconstruction and material reuse can fit into town policy and how we can develop that over time and how it works into our overall sustainability goals within the town, which we're in the middle of creating at the moment. So one of the things I keep saying is we need miracles. We need miracles for lots of things, everything from sustainable reuse of materials, through dredging, through energy, through historic preservation, you name it, we need it. I'm going to have to explain a bit more about miracles in a minute. It's probably my new favorite topic, but just let's explain a little bit about sustainability first. So there's 3 core aspects to sustainability: environmental parts, the economic parts, and the equity parts, sometimes called the social parts of sustainability. All 3 of those aspects have to work together in what I call the 3 E's for how we can have something function in a sustainable way. And this is when I keep talking about miracles. But I like it as an acronym rather than any other way of looking at it. I want to match our historic character, but also look to our future to make sure that we can have the equity we need to ensure we can have the preservation and understand our historic character and not lose a sense of ourselves. So this involves using what we already have around us. And this is where miracles is important. Making island resources a collaborative local effort for sustainability. It is one of my new little acronyms to try and make sure that we can see how we can include sustainable actions into everything we do. So I'm just going to look at a little way of how we can do that in relation to building materials and deconstruction and materials reuse, because this all feeds into maintaining our historic fabric. And I know I'm borrowing from some of the previous themes and some of the future themes that are going to be discussed here as well today. But the historic fabric, as Holly has explained to me, is what the character of our homes are. And we are just talking about our homes as far as this effort is concerned, and some other ancillary type buildings and other municipal buildings as well, potentially, which would be just wonderful. So we already talked about the environmental part of sustainability. And here's how you can include it by looking at the carbon savings, keeping embodied carbon within the property and within materials, reduce transportation emissions so we don't have to bring so many things here or move deconstructed or demolished materials off island. Reduce landfill emissions, because once we do put things into landfill, things decompose, we get carbon being broken down, methane being released, and that is net negative and bad for our environment and for our atmosphere, triggering more of the climate problems we're already starting to see. We reduce our disposal volume, which is clearly and obviously a good thing as we look forward to the future of where we have to close our town dump, and how the construction and demolition building works and operates. And it reduces overall demolition waste. The next leg is the equity leg. I'm going to hit the same theme twice between this and the next one, but it is effectively cheaper materials for people to use to build homes. And when we already have an overly stretched housing market to some degree, if you can get lucky and get yourself a plot of land and try and build something on it and have cheaper materials, all the better for the person building the home. And this is where I bring back in retaining the historic fabric. Mary already said it, it's materials that might have come from one building and be in another, but it stays on island and keeps our character in place. And it might also be better to look towards industrial regulation. How do we regulate our building industry so that we can understand how this might work in a fair way for everyone? And again, from the economic side, from the people that are buying and selling materials, this reusing of building materials would lead to, again, cheaper materials. It could also lead to new skilled jobs, effectively create a new industry on island. And it would reduce dump fees. People would have to pay less to get into the dump by weight, because that's how it tends to work there. And it would reduce shipping costs for things that are shipped off island. And of course, it would lead to economic development by creating a whole new industry. So this is the house that sustainability built. But before we get onto that, I'm just going to look at different options of how this might all work. And the main one and the best option in some respects, and one of my favorites, is move the whole house. Move it to a different site, and you get to maximize your carbon savings and move along. And this is the best option in some ways. There's already a town bylaw that covers this. It's the demolition delay bylaw. And you get 60 days to try and find somebody to take the house and move it off-site before a building is demolished. It wouldn't be lovely to see that term of time increased. And there's an existing program that Nantucket Housing Trust and Annie Kutzba and her organisation run, where they have people waiting in the wings to take these homes if there's a suitable matchup between a person who's ready to take a home, has a site they can move it to, and can get a company in place to move that building. This is all done, of course, through HDC approvals. And I encourage people to sign up for it if they can't. I'm looking into it. But we also have to look at how this fits in one of our existing activities of moving homes. As Holly says, we've been doing it for centuries here in Nantucket. And it does hit all of the sustainability goals. It fulfills the equity because it makes a cheaper building available for somebody to reuse. It obviously has the carbon savings, making it an environmentally friendly way of doing it. And because it's cheaper. Sound died. Oh, we're back. Thank you. He's right there. Thank you very kindly. So fulfilling the economic part of it. And as has been said many times before, and will be said many times here again today, this is a Nantucket tradition. It is part of our local ethos. And if it doesn't work, the HDC are okay with it, then sadly we have to go down the demolition route, which, as we've already heard from Mary, we have to know when to say thank you and goodbye to the house, to quote Mary Kondo. Sorry. So when we look at deconstruction, we have kind of two key options as I can see it at the moment. And this is all just looking at it from the kind of forward-looking way. How could we do this, and trying to see, well, what policies could we put in place? What infrastructure could we put in place? And the way that I see this working is that we could have a town facility, and this has been widely discussed and people are quite interested in this idea. Or we could do it separately like other communities and have a bylaw in place. So what I'd like to do now is go through how we might have a town facility, how that might function, how it could work, and then how a bylaw might work by comparison. And they're two very different tracks. So to explore the town facility first, we're going to have to find a place for deconstruction materials to go. And there was a great report done recently. I think it was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I'm going to misquote it now. Please, somebody correct me. EBC. Thank you. And they developed this wonderful plan for possible locations where such a building might go. But when we look at it, the building would probably, and in the report they have similar numbers, be something in the region of about 15 to 20,000 square feet. It'd be a big facility. But we have to understand what that means, just try and visualize it. I kind of went around and had a look at a few things and tried to cruise on the town website and look for similar sized buildings or big buildings so people get an actual idea of what 15 to 20,000 square feet would be. When you go to the dump on a Saturday or Sunday morning and you go up to the recycling facility and there's all those doors where you put down your plastic and your tin and your cardboard and such, that whole building itself that goes back quite a distance and is, what would you say, maybe 35, 40 yards from east to west, that by itself is a 20,000 square foot building. And that's big enough to take large-scale machinery and out of. But the ground plan, the footprint is 20,000 square feet. The Dreamland, right here in the downtown area, just the footprint on the ground, not upstairs or anything, that's about a 10,000 square foot building. Right here, our Whaling Museum, the footprint of this building is about 15,000 square feet. So we'd need something at least the size of this building potentially. But if you want to get seriously ambitious and have such a massive centre that we can take the extreme volume of property we have on this island over time, just look at Stop and Shop. The the big one, Mid-Island, about 38,000 square feet. So maybe somewhere between something the size of the Dreamland and Stop and Shop is what we'd need to have a facility to be able to have deconstructed materials stored and processed. But it's not just that. You also have to have the access roads, the parking, and a loading and unloading area. You have to bring all of those into mind. You also have to look at the materials you're dealing with. We're going to have windows that have lead paint on them and door frames and that kind of thing. And don't forget, kids think lead paint tastes sweet. It's a known hazard that you just have to be careful of. So we have to remove those hazards from any materials we want to reuse. Discuss that. And then there's other materials like asbestos that we have to look at how do we deal with those in a safe and effective way so people don't end up with mesothelioma. So then the next question is, who would undertake the deconstruction? Would it be town staff, contractors and builders, or something else? If it were contractors and builders to help get an industry going, one idea is to have tax incentives. Talk about more of that in a second. And who will staff the facility? Would it be town employees? Would it be private contractors, or how would that work? And what would the annual running costs be? Do you have to sell the items in order to fund and recoup the money that goes into it? What would their salaries be, and how would you fund that through sales? Would they be town staff on pension funds, or would they be private employees? There's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts, and some unknowns, but just stuff to start thinking about. If we did have such a town facility, how would it operate, and who would be best to run it? And then some materials won't go straight away, and they might end up ultimately not being of use and never being taken by anyone. Then the best obvious point would be to take it to the construction demolition building at the dump, so you still have to dump it anyway. You're not going to be able to reuse everything that's brought to such a facility. And would extra taxes have to fund it? And there's a big question in that one alone. Then there's the concept too, when I was chatting about bylaws, and this is something that's been done in other jurisdictions and municipalities, not necessarily in Massachusetts, but we've got examples from Texas that we've been looking at quite closely. But this would have to involve the creation and the writing of a new bylaw for the town. And that alone takes time, and that could take years to get right. It would probably also have to have a set of guidelines in order to understand what materials you reuse, how they're reused, how they're processed, how they're handled, and what their value might be. But the best thing I could think is, if it was a bylaw, to get industry to set this up, we offer a set of tax incentives in order to allow, say, construction companies, newly developed deconstruction companies, to come in, have a tax break for a significant amount of time so they can get their companies set up and understand where things are going. This is how the guidelines might work. This is kind of where I'm looking at next for the guidelines. And the biggest thing we'll have to understand is the market will determine the material demand, and the guidelines will have to accommodate them. It doesn't matter if it's free or if it's for sale or at a very low cost. The market will still say what comes out of these kinds of facilities, whether it's town or from building groups. The primary thing that I think would be easiest to move through would be copper and other similar recyclables. Doors, door frames, windows, fireplaces, all of the things that are historic fabric and easily recognizable interior features. And also bathroom sets and kitchen sets have reuse. Marble is the kind of thing that doesn't go off or out of style. Unique features in buildings can also be saved. And that's something else that we could try and find a nice part of a center for storing these things in. Secondary interest might be things like lumber. Once you start to pull the house apart and get the old growth lumber, the very fine grain stuff, you can see on the bottom picture, there's two pieces of lumber, the old fine grain stuff and the new younger secondary growth with much wider grain span, which has very different properties and very different uses. Pressure-treated lumber could also be stored in a separate area or reused in different ways. Flooring materials, particularly hardwood flooring and laminate flooring, that can be taken up relatively easily sometimes. But then there are difficult materials that when you're trying to deconstruct a house and take stuff out that you're not going to be able to take out easily with a lot of specialized ability or really well-trained people. I have never successfully removed drywall or tiles without breaking all of them, sad to say. Roofing materials, by the very nature that you've already put a nail through it once, it's hard to imagine that being reused. And insulation, fiberglass insulation for the sake of argument, there are other types too, of course, but they're hard to recover. They've already had a life in a building. They might not necessarily have the same properties as the day they went in. So you have to consider, well, what do we take, what can't we take? There are also other materials that are difficult, particularly white goods. This is something of a problem for the town. It'd be simpler for a private organization or building groups to be able to undertake this. The biggest problem with a lot of the white goods is that they might have, say, a refrigerator might have chemicals in it, CFCs and other refrigerants, which then, if not properly handled, can actually contribute to our greenhouse gas situation. We also don't know if the machine would have a warranty. We would have to give it away in as-is condition, and if heaven forbid there was ever an issue with it, there would be potential for recourse for somebody to sue the town for a faulty machine. And that would bring in unnecessary legal challenges. There might also be recalls on machines. We need to understand this. It's an unnecessary risk for the town to take. So, all right, we've been through all this now. We understand that there's potential for a facility and a bylaw to create, to have private industry effectively create these on their own sites and on their own terms and understand what materials are useful to them. But the conclusion is, there is no real result. We're still investigating possibilities. This is quite early in the discussion. I'd like to advance this, and I'd like to seek feedback from everyone, please. If you have anything, please email me, talk to me, find me. My office is at 131 Pleasant Street in the old fire station. You go to Stop and Shop, you come to me before or after. We can all have a nice chat about it and think, well, what do people want to see? How does this want to function? Is a bylaw better? Do you prefer to see a big facility? Who will run it? How will we work it? And with all of that, I would actually like to ask everyone to act sustainably and say thank you and see if there's any questions before. Do we have time for questions? Thank you kindly, everyone. Any questions? Or is everyone just eager for a break? Yes, sir.
So you have to contend with some energy codes when we're moving houses these days. For example, if you wanted to move a house and renovate it more than 50%, you're not going to be able to reuse old windows and stuff like that. Have you started to consider how to work around the HERS codes for energy?
We're going to start looking into that, and I'm sure myself and the energy coordinator, Lauren Sinatra, we can put our heads together, start looking at how that would work together. Like I was trying to say, we're at the kind of early concept stage, trying to understand it. I'm more or less trying to see the building side of it first, but you're exactly right. There will be energy codes and there'll be building codes and wind hurricane codes that we're going to have to contend with, among other things. Correct.
As the preservation planner in the room, I have to say that we have many structures on this island that are contributing, therefore can actually be exempt from the substantial compliance section of the building code. Therefore, we can still move structures, hopefully without not having to comply with a lot of these building codes that are being forced down and be sustainable in that regard.
Thanks, Holly.
I'll just add to that. I'll be speaking next around embodied carbon, and it won't be in the near future. We'll be able to quantify carbon in buildings, not just from an operational standpoint, but from a material standpoint, and then look at the entire map of the building. So there'll be substantial accommodations for materials as well as operation, hopefully in the near future, by 2030.
Thank you.
Hi.
Is that it? Yep.
I have a question. Here. So this is great and absolutely well needed. It's kind of needed almost immediately at this point when you see the volume that goes into the landfill, i.e., and also the example of the demoed house on Sherburne just recently. And you know, there are I was curious why you started with such a large facility. I had run all the numbers on this, and actually a smaller facility to start could be accommodate the bulk of what's going on into landfill, and then the net return on that in deconstruction is really equivalent to almost $1.6 million in the resale based on like $100 a ton of material that's demolished and brought in for resale. I just think personally, I think this needs to happen on a much more timely basis. This can't go on for years. It's been years already, and I'm happy to share the information I have about this.
Wonderful, thank you.
In reference to timely basis, there was a Facebook group started over a year ago called Nantucket architectural salvage. There's about 860 members. There certainly could be a whole lot more, and we could roll something out so people know about it. But it's been somewhat effective as on a very small scale, but people who have things post, doors, windows, material. And so in the interim, before the building happens or before other things, people are trying to do things.
Oh, 100% agree. And it would be, I suppose the easiest way of saying it is this, it would be a formalization of exactly what we've been doing on Nantucket for generations, and even in very organized way on social media of late. It is very much the same principle. It's just organizing in a different way into a more grand scale so we lose less. Yes, sir.
You spoke about a facility and then recycling. So the rumor is the DPW will be moving at some point sooner than later. And so maybe some of the facilities at the DPW site on Nantucket Road could be the facility.
It's certainly a possibility. And there's been discussions at Select Board about the DPW shifting location to a mid-island point. And then that site would have to go through redevelopment, and then would be a potential reuse for a number of different things, including material salvage and reuse. I've also heard it touted for about a half dozen other ideas too, but it's certainly on the list that I've heard. Well, thank you very kindly, everybody. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Holly. So we've got a 15-minute break. And I'm really happy to introduce Andy Pacino. Andy is the Energy Division Director of Stevens & Company. Andy is the director, well, I just said that, of Energy Division of Stevens & Company. There you go. It was so nice I had to say it twice. He's a home energy rater and a passive house rater. A builder since 1998, he began as a residential framer in San Diego, and then ran Pacino Enterprises Incorporated, a general contracting firm, for 15 years on Nantucket, focused on remodeling, BE, retrofit, cellulose insulation on dozens of renovation projects. He's currently a member of ResNet's Emerging Leadership Council and the Northeast HERS Alliance Board, and Andy co-chairs the Northeast HERS Embodied Carbon Committee. This team developed the concept and language around a ResNet, a NSI ICC standard for embodied carbon. This national standard was approved for adoption in August 2023 and is currently in development. So please join me in welcoming Andy.
When do I push? Mary. Good afternoon. Materials matter. I want to start by thanking Remain for the hard work that they've done in putting forth the idea of salvage, and Virna for her hard work, and thanks to Mary and Holly for pulling this together, and Vince too, who I haven't met yet, but I look forward to talking to you afterwards. Vince, is there a buzz? Okay. Oh, is that it? Okay. Oh, that's better. Thanks. I'm not going to add anything to my bio or my background. Thank you, Mary. That was a nice introduction. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to hearing John and May speak also. I haven't met them yet today either. They're the real experts in the room around salvage. It's really important. But I am a preservationist, a builder, and an environmentalist. And how do you compromise those things, especially when you're building predominantly new construction on Nantucket? I'll show you how. So yeah, materials matter, and I've become something of a geek around embodied carbon over the past 5 years. It's emerged as a really vital component to construction materials use globally, and we'll go through a lot of that. So because I skipped my intro, I'm skipping a slide too, so bear with me. Just quickly on this, Americans are using goods 5 times faster than the earth can replenish them. That's a lot. Materials have widely become recognized as a carbon sink. In other words, materials can extract carbon from the atmosphere, and then we can put them into our buildings. I really like this. This slide showed up in my inbox on Monday. A preservationist and a fellow embodied carbon geek, I guess, for lack of a better term, Lloyd Alter from Carbon Up Front. 25 years ago, nobody worried about what was then called embodied energy. We heated leaky buildings with gas and made electricity with coal, so operating energy overwhelmed it. And then it wasn't long where we decided, hey, well, let's tear down those buildings and replace them with LEED certified buildings or super efficient homes, but we just tossed out the baby with the bathwater, right? So that's why we're here today. So this chart here is really vital because the bottom 2 rays are highly efficient building and a moderately efficient building. And the state of Massachusetts is somewhere in the middle. And you'll see the black line shows the embodied carbon in a building, a typical building. And the bottom chord is important because over years, it takes a long time for embodied carbon to catch up with operational carbon. So the more efficient the building, the more intensive the materials are in the overall footprint of the building. And that's what this shows. Drop my new pointer. So this is our most recent ad. I work at Stevens & Company with Will Stevens. We planted 32,401 trees to offset every square foot of building that we built in the past couple of years. So we're walking the walk and talking the talk. I'm really proud of this and will continue to do so. It was determined by Michael Zyman, a New Jersey builder, that 1 tree offsets 1 square foot of new construction. Of course, old growth trees are substantially better than new, right? But you got to start somewhere, so we're planting them now. So cradle to cradle and the circularity gap. We're talking about reusing, recycling, upcycling. Cradle to cradle is a design philosophy developed by a couple of architects, Michael Brongart and William McDonough. And this approach suggests that raw materials are not thrown away from cradle to grave, as was typical in recent century, but are reused indefinitely or serve as food for new products. This book was from 2002, and it really changed the dialogue for me. I recognized that what we were doing on a daily basis was really intensive. Now, how do we improve it, and how do we make it better? And that was the goal. So this has been confirmed that we're expecting to build 1 Paris every week for the next 40 years. That's 2,080 Parises. So we're talking about a lot, and that's globally, not just here on Nantucket. We're talking about a lot more than recycling and reducing our personal footprints. It's going to take a concerted effort globally, governments, businesses, and all of us. I'd argue the failure to tackle the climate crisis is far more expensive. Already this year, there's been 137 weather incidents of $1 billion or more just in the States. So to build 2,080 Parises, where's the stuff going to come from? In 2017, the Circularity Gap Report was first issued. It highlights the urgent need to transition to a circular economy. We aim to empower key decision makers in both government and business to coordinate action to accelerate this transition. So I started paying attention to this a couple of years ago. We're actually doing worse We went from 8.4% reuse to 7.2 in this last report. So it's kind of on the downward swing, so we have to improve there. But this is a really interesting and vital report. This image is both hilarious and horrifying at the same time. It's funny to me because it represents global extraction in what looks like a small city block. But what it says, I'm sorry you can't read that. But what it says is that we're using 92 gigatons of extraction in this throughput, which is the global economy, and we're only recycling a circularity metric of 7.16 gigatons, so around 7.4%. What's a gigaton? So I know I went real macro on everybody. We were talking about Nantucket and downtown, and what's a gigaton? A gigaton is equivalent to 10,000 fully loaded US aircraft carriers. I did some back of the napkin math, and it's 2,500,000 whaling ships. So that's 92 gigatons times that. 36 gigatons of waste. So, globally, this is what we're up against. And then what role do buildings play? Be as energy efficient as possible. This is from the report. These are their 4 criteria for improving buildings as a participant in this process. Be as energy efficient as possible, make the most of what already exists, prioritize circular materials and approaches, and reuse waste. Waste ties back to cradle, because if we're reusing it, it's no longer waste. Okay, so what can we do in our backyard? And so my team has been working on whole life cycle analysis of the carbon intensity of buildings. As an energy consultant and HERS rater, we already understand and map what the operational costs are of heating and cooling your home, et cetera, hot water. Our team has kind of embraced this idea of understanding what the materials costs are too. This is from the New Buildings Institute. What's the whole life cycle of a building? From module A1 through D, A1 being the product extraction, transport to the factory, and the manufacturing of products. This is what my team's focused on. This is what we're talking about today. C1 through D. And this is what HERS raters already track. This is the entire life cycle of a building, or the whole life cycle, and that's what we're trying to analyze. So how do we understand what the value of the materials that we're putting into buildings costs? It's called an environmental product declaration. And I come from a family of chefs, so I really like the idea that it's actually a nutritional value of the materials in your house. This actually comes from Owens Corning, the Pink Panther insulation. So this is effusive across materials globally. Everyone's starting to report it. So it's not mandated yet, but it's likely that just because everyone else is doing it, every manufacturer globally is soon to have a nutrition label for their building. And the fact that this comes from Owens Corning is kind of a testament to that. Concrete's extremely intensive. I think everyone here understands that. It's the #1 emitter globally. There are over 80,000 concrete EPDs in existence in North America right now. So the writing's on the wall. All right, everyone knows these buildings. Probably most of us have been through them or walked by them even as recently as today. So imagine for a moment building these buildings today from brick. Not almost 200 years ago. I'm going to go forward and then back. Here's the nutritional value of a brick. And a cubic yard or cubic meter which is essentially like a pallet. We see pallets of bricks, pallets of stone. A cubic meter of brick is 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which may not resonate with you yet, but it will in a minute. Globally, bricks are the most carbon-intensive process, more than anything else. 2.7% of global emissions comes from brick manufacturing, or what does that say, 1 billion tons? That's just from emissions and the production process. So again, going back to the whole life cycle analysis, it's A1 to A3, just manufacturing those bricks. It's not putting them in the building. But here's good news. If the bricks are already in the building, they don't cost anything. So the least carbon intensive building is one that's already built. And so that's what we're talking about. Here we go. So we talked about that already, thanks. So what does a metric ton of carbon dioxide look like? It's loosely the size of a Cape Cod home. A lot. So 1 cubic meter of bricks is half the size in carbon dioxide. So I'm the embodied carbon chair of the Northeast HERS Alliance, and we've collaborated with BEAM, Builders for Climate Action, built the BEAM tool, which is a tracking software to track environmental product declarations across the built environment. It was uniquely built for builders. There's a whole host of softwares for large commercial buildings, institutions, and so on. But BEAM and Chris Magwood really tackled residential construction head on and made it really digestible for builders and HERS raters, energy consultants to really tackle this. It looks like this. It's really interesting and very simple to use, like most spreadsheets that we use today. So for example, this is suggesting timber posts and beams, heavy timber framing average. So it's taking kind of an aggregate because they didn't have a specific report for this one. 2.9 cubic meters is 575 kilograms of CO2e. I only show it because it's instructive. That's how simple the tool is. So as HERS raters, we already map an entire building, and we understand pretty cleanly all the component parts to the exterior shell. So our idea was that, okay, well, let's take those inputs and see if we can streamline it so that we can do it at a rapid pace, so we can get real reporting. And now I can do, and our team can do, on a whole building that we've already HERS rated in about 20 minutes. So here was my trial run. This is my coworker Ron Lynch's house. He said I could use his name. This is a structural insulated panel house, a SIP house. Ron designed it himself. It's super efficient. It's net zero operationally because he's got solar panels on it. It's a HERS minus 27, if that means anything to anybody in the room. It's an amazing house. But then, I gave him the bad news that it was pretty carbon intensive because he used SIPs. I love Ron. It's a great house. I'm not I'm not disparaging him, but we used it as an example. And so what it is it shows this SIP roof, 18 tons of CO2 equivalent. So it's beautiful, operationally negative. He's sending energy back to the grid, but to build the building, using an awful lot of CO2 equivalent. Nice thing about the BEAM tool is we can do trade-offs, so we can understand real time what switching materials might do, and it gives us the top 10 and highest impact outputs. And so foam is really expensive environmentally. SIP panels are expensive. Here's concrete. Concrete seems low, right? But it's because Ron's house was built on piers, so we used a fraction of what the concrete would typically be for an 8-foot basement. We ran a number of scenarios showing all these different inputs, but I won't show them today. One was really important though that I wanted to show, because we're talking about biogenic materials and we're talking about materials that rapidly can regrow. One of the interesting emerging technologies is straw. And so there's a number of companies up in Maine that are growing growing their own straw on farms, producing modular panelized homes and selling them. And there's a backlog. They're building them as fast as they can. They're selling them like hotcakes. So we've actually, my wife's here. I think she knows that we're going to put one in our backyard. So by using straw and making the same structure, we were actually making a carbon sink. The total emissions from this project because of the straw as a panel is 2.5 tons sunk embodied carbon. So it's a pretty remarkable flip-flop to go from almost 40 tons. And then to bring it back to our bricks, the US standard for bricks intensity is in the beam tool. So I reclad Ron's cedar shake house or cedar sidewalled house with bricks, and it added another almost 18 tons of CO2 to his structure. So materials really matter. And just for perspective, that's that cape. There's Ron's house built with SIPs. Here's Ron's house by replacing the SIPs and the foam in the SIPs with cellulose insulation, which is recycled newspaper, which is what I installed for some time out here. And here's Ron's house as a straw house. So hopefully I've identified there's a mature way that we can actually track embodied carbon today, and be happy to collaborate with Vince on how we can start to analyze those metrics to revalue existing buildings and understand how they can play a really vital role. And to Jeff's point about HERS ratings and energy dynamics, if we can take the whole footprint of a building and eliminate, say for a brick, it may not be as energy efficient, but if we can quantify the materials that went into that building and give that a score, we've fundamentally changed the vitalness of that building product. So I'm hoping that happens sooner than later. Our first technical committee meeting is Monday, where we're evolving the national standard. And my guess is 18 months from now, it'll be a usable product, but then to train the workforce to do it. But we can do it, and we can do it today. And I am on a number of projects, so I'd be happy to collaborate with anybody in this room. So how do we move forward? I don't know. That's why we're here, trying to figure it out. How do we move forward on Nantucket? How do we solve these fundamental problems and these challenges that we've all faced, really for my whole career here? We've all pulled nails out of boards to reuse them. We've sanded old barn boards to make furniture. There's a lot of value to those things. We need to revalue them and try to monetize it. Because at the end of the day, this is about builders and making builders' jobs more reasonable, more equitable, and we're ultimately trying to make them prosperous while doing the right thing. And that's what Stephen's company, we call it fiscal environmentalism. It doesn't cost more to do the right thing. So we want to prove it today so that tomorrow we can roll out solutions environmentally. Thank you.
I usually don't need a microphone.
You don't need a mic, Linda.
I know. I normally don't need a microphone. But Andy, do things, because I've worked, as you know, in construction, and do things like whether you use blue board or sheetrock or plywood or strand board or plastic trim or epay versus mahogany, closed cell versus the Pink Panther. Do those little nuances make a difference in the rating and the carbon footprint?
Every piece. Every piece. So there's over 100,000 products in the beam tool and almost 250,000 nationally. And I would say that, be 500 million globally within the next 5 years. It's almost mandated. And again, if you want to compete in the market, and you're going to take any government incentive for producing a product, whether it's petroleum or fiberglass or foam or a straw panel, you're going to need to show the EPDs. You're going to need to evidence it, just like food, right? That was the 1930s, 1940s, where we started to put nutritional values on food. Before that was the Wild West. So still the Wild West for materials, but it's, the gap is closing quickly. Good question. Mm-hmm.
And they're not using the fiberglass, which I can't stand. I have polystyrene because I have a post and beam with 9-inch thick walls.
Mm-hmm.
By going to most of us blowing in closed cell insulation, is that a worse thing to do than the pink fiberglass, or are we just evolving? Materials are evolving in the course of construction, but are they evolving in a good way, or we're just making it worse?
Another good question. It's market demand, and the market shifts in a couple of ways. What's least expensive and what's government mandated. And the third metric is what's most best performing, right? That's kind of the last thing, because you're not going to put what's best if the government's not telling you that it has to meet a certain threshold. So like anything, and just like an operational HERS rating, it's an aggregate of all the parts, right? So you could put, in Ron's example, he built a brilliant house. It was operationally negative. And with a couple of tweaks, with the design side, attention, now we can solve all those things. So none of them are bad, Linda. I'm not here to say one thing versus another is bad. Everything has its place in moderation. So let's not be committed to the most intensive because it's easy. Let's learn new tools. And that's why the builders are the hinge, as always, in construction. Because without trained, educated, and mobilized and compensated builders, you're not going to get the attention that you need. So it's a broad stroke problem or challenge, but it's a great opportunity. So you could replace your foam with wood panels that are made up in Maine at a recently refurbished 1 million square foot facility where they're using pulp salvaged from the paper mills, in addition to some new growth and other processes where they're producing rigid insulation made from wood, which performs similarly to some of the foam products. So it's out there and it's happening fast. So we source those things anytime we can. Hemp is now being used as bat insulation. There's 10 facilities in the country. Idaho just built another $1 million facility. The billions of dollars are being put into these biogenic material sources so that we can actually make impactful choices. So that's part of the Inflation Reduction Act. Money's being spent in all these places. And we can deliberate whether or not spent in good places all the time, but the point is, it's happening. These teams and these businesses, corporations are being incentivized to build really carbon-savvy materials. And hemp was used in the turn of the last century, but then was quickly kind of obscured by cotton, right? Well, now hemp has reemerged as this really fascinating product that's also a carbon sink, just like straw. And it performs as a bat insulation. You can replace mineral wool with it. You can replace fiberglass with it, cellulose, and it performs the same. And interestingly enough, they're actually getting a fire rating so that it will perform similarly to rock wool or mineral wool in foundations where we need a fire protection. So the innovations are really remarkable. That's why I'm really happy to be in this space. It's inspiring. It's not going anywhere, and it's a long career ahead of me. And I hope that people in this room would consider it as kind of pivots to potential careers too. One more question?
Yeah, a quick question. Thanks so much for the presentation. We're getting 30 barge trips a year of sand, and I ran the numbers. It's almost 1,000 tons of carbon between the trucks and the barge every year. Just curious to get your thoughts on, bringing back local sand production on island, and if this is something you've, worked on or thought about.
I haven't considered it. It's a good challenge. We'll get to work tomorrow on it. No, but an interesting opportunity that hasn't been addressed is different additives besides Portland cement and concrete. I don't know if any of the concrete suppliers are here, but pulverized glass saves over 50% of the carbon emissions. And there's a couple of plants in New England that are pulverizing glass into pozzolan, which performs equivalently to Portland. You still need some Portland. But no, I haven't considered the sand intensity at all. Our Friendship Lane is built in the old sand pit. So I'm glad my house is there and it's not still a sand pit. Any other questions? Next speaker.
So much, Andy.
Thank you.
All right, thanks to Andy. And what I'm hearing is we need some land for a salvage facility. We need a building that isn't going to be a total carbon sink, because that would sort of defeat the purpose of what it is we're talking about here. So if you've got a building or some land, let us know, or know someone who does. I would like to introduce our next speaker, John Livermore. John Livermore is a principal for sustainability services at EBP. John is a creative sustainability professional with 30 years experience and a proven track record of success designing and implementing award-winning energy efficiency and clean transportation programs and sustainability projects in collaboration with utilities, federal and state agencies, municipalities, clean energy stakeholders, and private clients. He's worked at architecture and engineering firms, solar energy companies, energy and environmental nonprofit organizations as a private consultant, and having founded 2 mission-driven sustainability organizations. John had the opportunity to address sustainability challenges from multiple perspectives. He enjoys working collaboratively with clients and bringing his experience to bear to solve problems. John's team recently completed a 2-phase feasibility study about construction and demolition waste on Nantucket that MPT contracted with the help of Remain, and its potential for salvage and reuse. And EBP is a Boston-based company that provides state-of-the-art economic analysis and research to support planning and policy. So please join me in welcoming John Livermore.
Hopefully I'll get the arrow right. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here, and a big thank you to Mary and Virna's team for their amazing support throughout this project. We couldn't have done it without them. So yes, my firm, EBP, is a sustainability and economics firm in Boston with our head office in Switzerland, actually. And it was really fascinating to hear Andy's presentation. I returned from a trip to Zurich last week where I had the pleasure of meeting with the gentleman who's responsible for all of the Swiss embassies around the world. And his key message was accounting for embodied carbon is the next big thing in the market. So this is a worldwide phenomenon, not just here in the US. And they actually made a strategic decision to renovate their London and Singapore embassies to add on to the existing building as opposed to demoing and building new. And the really cool thing is that what happens in London and in Singapore affects us here in Massachusetts, and what we do in Massachusetts affects them as well, because we're all in this biosphere together. So I have the pleasure of working with a great team at EBP. Adam, Brett, and Allison also contributed to the study, but you'll have to put up with just me today. I head up the sustainability division at EBP, trained as an architect. I got off on the sustainability tangent a long time ago. And leading the building materials salvage study was a wonderful opportunity to explore a new way to approach sustainability. So our team came into this project firmly grounded in an understanding of the urgency of addressing the climate crisis through actionable and impactful approaches that support a more circular economy. Now, every year on Nantucket, more than 17,000 tons of construction and demolition waste is transported off island, much of which eventually ends up in landfills in Ohio and in Maine. And much of this waste is a result of demolition of buildings on Nantucket, and a significant portion of these discarded materials has the potential to be salvaged and reused through deconstruction. So we kicked off our study in 2021 with a meeting with the WPI students who the previous year had done some great research on deconstruction practices on Nantucket. And we used their baseline work as a springboard for designing and executing our study scope. So our project was divided into two phases. Phase one for Remain Nantucket was the market impact and feasibility analysis, where we looked at supply of reusable materials, attitudes around deconstruction, economic value of reusable materials, businesses which benefited from and how, workforce needs, avoided carbon emissions, and salvage facility feasibility. And in phase two, which we did for Nantucket Preservation Trust, we explored existing working models around the US and then new ordinance development. And we researched regulations elsewhere, models of collection and distribution, support for affordable housing, other organizations' experiences, residents' perspectives, which was very enlightening and great, strategic partnerships, and development or potential development of an ordinance. And ultimately, the goal was to provide actionable insights into how better to use Nantucket's building and construction resources through comprehensive deconstruction policy while having a positive impact on the island's long-term sustainability. I'll note that a theme throughout our study was a frequent emphasis on the affordable housing challenge on the island. Rents are relatively high relative to the rest of the state and the nation as a whole. In a recent US Census Bureau survey, the median rent for a two-bedroom house unit on Nantucket was just over $1,800 per month, 27% higher than the Massachusetts statewide median. And the high cost of housing on Nantucket presents a challenge for year-round residents as well as seasonal workers. So we looked for linkages between building materials salvage solutions and affordable housing solutions. So first, we estimated the supply of salvageable construction and demolition materials by weight, volume, and pieces in order to then estimate the value of reusable materials, estimate avoided carbon emissions, and then estimate the space needed to collect, stage, store, and distribute or sell the materials. And this figure presents the approximate distribution of C&D materials by type based on information from the Vancouver Demolition Waste Calculator. And wood represents the largest share of total waste at over 8,000 tons. So the total estimated value of reusable materials using the $100 per ton figure, which we've verified, is close to $500,000 each year. So we conducted 9 interviews with residents to better understand attitudes and opinions on deconstruction and reuse of salvaged materials on island. And in general, people we interviewed were very supportive of more deconstruction on Nantucket, but had various concerns. We heard repeatedly that deconstruction is more expensive than demolition, And as a result, it is often less expensive to purchase new materials for projects. To insurers and building codes require that certain materials be under warranty when used in new construction or renovations. And then there's the time sensitivity of clients wanting to complete projects quickly. And this map shows zones accepting lumberyard and warehouse uses. And there's a large concentration of properties around the airport, which is located within the large purple commercial industrial district, which is approximately 455 acres. So the main barriers to a salvage facility on island are high property costs, and that workers might require subsidization to pay them living wages, given the high housing costs. We also looked into labor costs, accessing a data set for the Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket regions, and to get a sense of expected labor costs for salvage facility workers. The closest equivalent to a salvage building materials facility worker was transportation and warehousing industry, where the median hourly wage is about $16 per hour and a median salary of $33,000 per year. According to MIT's living wage calculator, only an experienced warehouse laborer would earn a living wage on Nantucket, which is about $20 per hour for a single adult with no children, and certainly higher for families. And this suggests that wage subsidization or a housing allowance may be required to create living wage jobs at a salvage facility. This slide shows an order of magnitude comparison of demolition costs versus deconstruction costs for an average residential home. At the low end, deconstruction is actually slightly cheaper than demolition, and at the high end, deconstruction still costs about 45% more than demolition, or about $15,000. But by any of these approaches, the cost difference adds little actually to the total construction cost and is relatively small relative to the median and average home prices on island. This also doesn't include the revenue from resale of salvaged materials or the value of the tax benefit from donating salvaged materials, which can close the cost difference even more. Next, we looked at businesses and industries that will be most impacted by increased deconstruction and material reuse. This slide shows the downstream impacts of deconstruction compared to demolition. And the deconstruction process itself supports more jobs for more days of work than demolition. And the process of collecting, warehousing, and selling salvaged materials supports additional jobs. So deconstruction work is a skilled trade that requires more training, but which results in career living wage jobs. Then we estimated the potential job creation in deconstruction-related industries and unrelated industries that would also benefit from new transactions. There are an estimated 184 businesses on Nantucket in industries that are related to or impacted by deconstruction and material reuse. These businesses contribute about 1,300 jobs to Nantucket's economy, and these industries contribute approximately $320 million in GDP to the local economy. According to a study conducted by the city of San Antonio, activity in the circular waste stream generates many, many more jobs than landfilling or simply recycling waste. And looking at this in terms of jobs per 10,000 tons of waste, landfilling, which is a linear process, gets you about 1 to 6 jobs. Recycling, which is partially circular, gets you about 36 jobs. Whereas reuse, which is completely circular, gets you 300 jobs. And workforce development and training is also important for deconstruction. A Portland, Oregon study found that the amount of reusable building materials obtained from a deconstruction effort was highly correlated with the contractor performing the work, much more so than the age or size of the building being dismantled due to greater deconstruction skill and experience. So since reducing carbon emissions is so vital, as Andy was talking about, and Vince and everybody, we estimated the avoiding carbon emissions associated with reusable C&D materials that are currently put into the Nantucket waste stream. and the embodied energy of new materials required to replace those discarded materials. And Nantucket's unique geography obviously makes shipping materials to and from the island more cost and energy intensive than for most municipalities in Massachusetts. This graph illustrates the embodied and operational carbon across the life cycle of a building, from extracting raw materials to manufacturing of the product to transporting the product. And this is not the circular economy that we're looking for, but it is currently standard practice. And so here, as Mark Twain said, the biggest room in the house is the room for improvement. And here we have the avoided emissions from decreased transportation, landfilling, and new materials: CO2, nitrous oxides, sulfur dioxides, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, and ozone that's created when you combine a lot of those elements. The big impact here is transporting C&D waste to landfills. Reese Trucking, which is one of the two transporters on island, materials end up at Crossroads Landfill in Norwich Walk, Maine, which is 309 miles away from Nantucket. And this is a truck, ferry, truck-to-truck operation. Waste Options has materials that end up at Sunny Farm Landfill in Fostoria, Ohio, which is 908 miles away. Truck, ferry, truck to a 775 train mile trip. So you get a sense of why it's important to be reducing these materials. And there's an additional impact, the embodied carbon, in the creation of new materials to replace those discarded materials. And another big driver here is the Massachusetts 2030 Solid Waste Master Plan, which establishes goals to reduce disposal statewide by 30% by 2030 and 90% reduction in disposal by 2050. We have some big goals on the horizon, and I think we're on the right path here. So in the existing ordinance research and new ordinance development phase of our study, our team explored existing deconstruction and reuse ordinances around the country to see what elements might be applicable to the Nantucket community. Some ordinances, such as those in California, were driven by the need to meet the standards of state-level environmental legislation. Others were established in recognition of the significant contribution construction and demolition waste makes to landfills and to reduce municipal waste costs. Notably in Portland, Oregon, the ordinance was driven in large part by citizen dissatisfaction with the large amount of dust and noise being generated with the many demolition projects occurring in neighborhoods around the city. So there's a wide variety of ordinance types in use around the United States. Ordinances with deconstruction and reuse requirements. Some prohibit use of heavy machinery and so forth. Ordinances with diversion requirements, per square foot minimums, weight per square foot disposal maximums. Ordinances that use a scorecard requiring demolition permit applicants to earn a total number of points. And then applicability, type of activity, type of structure, residential or commercial, building age, size, or value. And for instance, in Vancouver, BC, their green demolition bylaw applies only to homes built before 1950, but applies a higher recycling minimum and an additional salvage requirement on homes built before 1910. In terms of enforcement, runs the gamut from fines and penalties to project delays, withholding final occupancy permits, deposit-based with refunds at the end of the project when the program requirements are finally met. And other miscellaneous pieces, use of approved contractors, haulers, or disposal facilities as a requirement, and then general reporting requirements pre and post project. The City of Vancouver, BC, again, created an online demolition waste generation calculator to help homeowners estimate the amount of waste that they'll be required to recycle by material type to meet municipal requirements. So the most common model for material reuse distribution is the nonprofit model. We analyzed 6 of these building reuse programs to identify key operational details. I looked at facilities in Boston, Springfield, Massachusetts, Portland, Oregon, San Francisco, Devens, Massachusetts, and the reuse people who are nationwide. And one of the standout nonprofit models is Eco Buildings Bargain in Springfield, Massachusetts, run by the nonprofit Center for Ecotechnology, which coincidentally was my first job out of college with them. Good people. The facility is a 30,000 square foot facility retail store and a 20,000 square foot building materials warehouse. And the facility is operated by 14 staff. They offer a pickup service, and the store has 2 donation representatives whose sole job is to develop relationships with builders, lumber yards, manufacturers, and other potential donors. And new materials are priced at 50% off of retail price and used materials 30%. And the store's projected sales of $1.5 million last year. So doing pretty well. And one of the best municipal models we found was the TIPS warehouse in Huntsville, Texas. The operation recruits donors and shoppers with ongoing community outreach through flyers, referrals from nonprofit organizations, online media, and word of mouth. The usable materials are brought to the city's transfer station, weighed, and then stored in a dedicated warehouse. An interesting for-profit model is Ballard Reuse in Seattle, Washington. The business offers materials pickup and deconstruction services and sells salvaged materials to the public. And they also accept donations on behalf of the Seattle nonprofit Recreative, who receives a percentage of the sales of those materials. We also looked at how different reuse operations integrate material reuse with affordable housing and found that all of these programs and facilities support affordable housing both directly and indirectly. And the 2 most common ways are, number 1, to steep material discounts to low-income customers and nonprofit organizations, and 2, the materials are actually not for sale and are available free to nonprofit organizations. So the takeaway here is that there are numerous models for successful building materials reuse programs and facilities that Nantucket can learn from in developing the best approach for the island. One of my favorite parts of the study was our outreach to key Nantucket stakeholders and organizations to gather their feedback and insights and to help build support for policy action on deconstruction and reuse. Our outreach consisted of email invitations and 30-minute video interviews with these 11 key Nantucket stakeholders, some of which I know are here in the room today. Our conversations consisted of input on the 4 general categories of deconstruction ordinances we found among U.S. municipalities, the ordinance's compatibility with Nantucket, and the interviewees' thoughts on how best to approach deconstruction and encourage building material reuse on the island. And I have to say, one of the most memorable interviews I had was with town preservation planner Holly Backus. She was a complete delight and a treasure trove of information on deconstruction, preservation, and Nantucket history. I learned a lot. The overall message that came through in all of the interviews was that each of the stakeholders cares deeply about preserving the architectural history of Nantucket, and they are committed to exploring ways to increase building deconstruction and materials reuse. Each of the stakeholders provided an assessment of the current state of building construction and material reuse from their vantage point in the Nantucket building ecosystem. And their observations and insights collectively provide an informative composite picture of the current landscape, including challenges that could be addressed through an ordinance or other market intervention. And I encourage you to read this section of our report, but here are some of the key thoughts that we heard, and I won't read through them, but highly valuable. And it's also worth noting that there's an informal building materials reuse system on Nantucket. I think that was mentioned earlier, including the Cape Cod and Islands Craigslist, the Nantucket Reuse Exchange, and the Facebook group Nantucket Architectural Salvage. So the overall takeaway from the stakeholder interviews is that this is a multifaceted problem requiring a holistic, integrated solution. A successful strategy will garner enough support from town residents and stakeholders, and it will likely require 5 things. linking solutions to support for affordable housing, establishing an on-island salvage materials facility, providing deconstruction training, town and stakeholder involvement in designing the strategy, and then number 5, exploring an ordinance with, again, 4 parts: a lengthened demo delay period, 6 to 12 plus months, like most other Massachusetts communities. 2, a demo fee or deposit program, and a revised process starting with the Historic District Commission and then advertising after that, and also including incentives and other support. And it's worth noting that of the 150 communities in the Commonwealth that have a demolition delay bylaw or ordinance, the town of Nantucket is an outlier as only one of 2 communities with a delay period of less than 3 months. Similar Massachusetts communities with historic districts such as Provincetown, Concord, and Chatham have demolition delay periods of 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months, respectively. And some further thoughts in developing an ordinance for Nantucket. Any ordinance must be paired with education and engagement. We must involve builders and the real estate industry in the conversation. We must communicate that ordinances promote sustainability. And a further option would be to provide grants directly to builders to offset the added costs of deconstruction. For instance, the town could potentially design a program to target buildings that are most likely to yield the most significant amount of reusable materials. And finally, we mapped the existing properties and their age to determine how many properties on the island could be impacted. This map shows tax parcels on Nantucket by year, which a structure on the parcel was built. And of the approximate 13,700 tax parcels on the island, about 9,600 contain a built structure. Of parcels containing a built structure, approximately 1,200 structures, or 13%, were built prior to 1900, shown in blue. An additional 2,200 structures, or 23%, were built between 1900 and 1975, shown in yellow. And over 6,100 structures, 64%, have been built after 1975, shown in red. Interestingly, the National Park Service considers 1975 to be the end of the period of significance for historical buildings that contribute to Nantucket's National Historic Landmark. About 3,500 parcels, or 36%, contain a structure built before 1975, many of which are located right here in town. So the phase 2 study results indicate that there are multiple policy approaches to encourage or require deconstruction and building material reuse that have been employed by communities around the US to support sustainability objectives. And beyond the clear environmental benefits, the other drivers to implementing deconstruction and reuse policy measures include historic preservation, depletion of natural resources, declining landfill capacity, cost savings, and the affordable housing crisis. So after identifying and analyzing the key strategies and leverage points, the primary recommendations of our study included convening stakeholders to build support and design and implement an ordinance, or start talking about it. I think that's partly the reason we're here today. Explore comprehensive deconstruction ordinance for approval at town meeting. Extend demolition delay period to 6 to 12 plus months. Revise the demolition delay process. Explore additional incentives for deconstruction to make it more cost effective. Devote resources to training workers. Establish an on-island materials storage facility. Partner with off-island materials reuse operations, potentially as an interim approach. And pursue deconstruction pilot concepts with the Habitat Cape Cod, who are interested in working out some cooperative arrangements. Use deconstruction ordinance fees and building material sales to support affordable housing, and create a public awareness campaign. And finally, make the deconstruction policy process and support mechanisms straightforward and easy to understand and navigate. And as one of the interviewed stakeholders said, people will do the right thing if it's not too difficult. You have to make it easy for them. So there are other innovative deconstruction and reuse models out there, including the Deconstruction and Reuse Network in Long Beach, California. It's a good example of a non-warehouse deconstruction and reuse program and combines a deconstruction network with a reuse network. The reuse people are headquartered in Oakland, California, with facilities in 8 states throughout the US. They operate retail warehouses and offer a range of deconstruction and materials reuse services, including deconstruction contracting. They also operate the Reuse Institute, also located in Oakland, which provides deconstruction training and certification. And finally, deconstruction contractor Goodwood illustrates Portland, Oregon's success. Over the past 4 years, the city has deconstructed more than 420 single-family and duplex homes that were registered as historic places or built before 1940. Goodwood has taken apart 160 of them. And overall, there are 19 contractors licensed to deconstruct in the city of Portland, thanks in part to a city-sponsored training program. And reports are that the cost of deconstruction has actually gone down since the rule went into effect. So this is all very exciting. There's so much happening around the country in the deconstruction and reuse space. And hopefully this has given you a sense of some of the options of what's possible for us here in Nantucket. So thank you. And we're really excited to see the next steps. Okay, you bet.
All right, if you're thinking of leaving, don't leave. You don't want to miss this next presentation. I mean, you can leave if you really have to leave. I know there's a select board meeting at 5:30, and 2 of our speakers have to go to that. But I hope that if you can stay, you will, to listen to May Boley, the executive director of Repurpose Savannah. I think you're really going to enjoy hearing what's going on in a group that is, years ahead of where Nantucket is now and where we could potentially go. Really inspiring and anyway, so there's that. Okay, you're not getting up. That's great. Repurpose Savannah is a Women Plus led nonprofit establishing a sustainable future through the deconstruction and reuse of historic buildings. Repurpose Savannah, hold on, let me put this up here, advocates for, where did I? Thanks. Advocates, educates, and provides a climate-conscious alternative to conventional demolition that mitigates environmental and public health impacts. They connect best practices for structural removal with historic preservation, emphasizing research and documentation to provide the diverse histories in their communities. They train Women Plus, including women identified, trans, non-binary, and other underrepresented women for careers in construction. May moved to Savannah in 2015 and became enamored of the city's historic buildings and romantic tree canopies. When she enrolled in historic preservation courses at Savannah Technical College, her interest in buildings turned into a passion for building materials. Now in her role as the executive director of Repurpose, she is professionally obsessed with old-growth lumber. Before she got bit by the historic building bug, she was a creative director for a manufacturing firm and market manager for an urban farm and a principal in her own marketing consultancy for creative startups. May holds a Bachelor of Art in Graphic Design and a Bachelor of Art in Classical Archaeology from the Florida State University, along with a Master of Art in Art Education from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming May.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me. This has been such an inspiring day. What an honor to be here in this community that's really looking to the future, looking to innovate and create a bright new world where history and sustainability can come together for the benefit of this whole beautiful community. Also, I got to say, this is my first time in Nantucket, and I'm just charmed to pieces, and I'm so grateful to be here. So without further ado, I don't need to cover this. I think we've got it. I put this slide up here because I'm often giving presentations in places that don't know what I'm talking about. But I left it in my presentation here for you today because I just like to underscore that deconstruction is a climate conscious and a preservation minded solution for structural removal. And that means it is not a green light to start tearing down our historic properties. I think there's a lot of fear sometimes in the preservation community that when we talk about deconstruction, we're talking about just willy-nilly going in there and taking all the old buildings down and replacing them with bright, shiny new buildings. As has been said by our colleagues here today, that is not necessarily the more climate conscious solution. I'm a die-hard preservationist. The most sustainable building is one that's already standing. And the day that preservation is successful, keeping every historic building standing, I will happily hang up my crowbar and go home and find a different job. But for the time being, we are losing our historic structures to the landfill. So how can we take care of them, even in the face of that structural loss? And this is how. People will be familiar with deconstruction in usually some aspect. So I'd like to clarify that even in this niche of the industry, there's a lot of variety. Most people are super familiar with what I call non-structural, but what you all probably will most recognize as architectural salvage. And these are the cute pieces. These are your mantles, your doors, your corbels and windows, all the pieces that do have high reuse potential. People are very familiar with this idea of building material reuse. We also see in this industry structurally compromising decon. What is this? Decon being short for deconstruction, excuse me. What is this? This is the result of some folks realizing that there is a high value in the structural members of historic buildings and going in, sometimes without permission, and stealing them and bringing them to market to make a lot of money. More often than not, this precipitates the loss of the building, and it also makes it more dangerous for my crew to come in and take it apart. To do what's best for the community. Unfortunately, this is the legacy of what salvage has become in the past few decades. It's not the only legacy, but it is certainly there. I'd like to see this put to an end. We need to be taking care of our buildings responsibly, and we need to acknowledge that reusing them doesn't have to look like, carnage, ripping them apart to sell them on the black market. Let's bring this into the light and realize that this has a healthy expression as well. So what my nonprofit offers is full service structural removal. At the end of the day, you're going to see probably the same thing that you'd see at the end of a deconstruction job, which is a clean dirt site. However, as you'll see in the course of my presentation, these two processes couldn't be more different. Full service in the sense that we provide removal of the structure, absolutely, all the way from the ridge beam down to your piers. We also research and document your building. We're also going to help you out with your permitting. We're going to do whatever we can. Anybody who's interested in this service, we're going to do what we can to help you access it. That's because this is new, or as we'll see, it's new again. And sometimes people need a little help to do the right thing, right? If we just make it easy, they'll do the right thing. We've talked a lot about how deconstruction is not new here on Nantucket, and that's true all over the country. So deconstruction and reuse, it doesn't stop with taking the building apart, but it really is this whole cycle, taking them apart and then reusing those materials. It is a practice as old as building itself. Demolition, as we'll see, is a pretty newfangled idea, but for the depth and breadth of human history, this is what we've done with our built environment. It would never have made any sense to take perfectly good building materials and put them in the trash and then go out into the wilderness and try to harvest brand new materials for our buildings. For time out of mind, this has been a traditional practice, and we most certainly approach it as a traditional craft. I'm happy to say that we're gaining some traction in the preservation community, being recognized as a heritage trade, and one of the aspects of training in traditional craft trades across the country. I'll talk about that a little bit more. This is a great article I recommend if you're curious about the history of deconstruction and reuse outside of Nantucket. This is written by my friend Allison Arlotta, and it's about deconstruction around the turn of the century in New York City. There is an incredibly cool time-lapse video on this webpage that shows a skyscraper in New York City being unbuilt brick by brick, something that is so beyond what we think about as possible today, but we've done it before and we can certainly do it again. I know that this is true because we do a lot of research, but I also know that this is true because I've taken many buildings apart, over 40 buildings in the last few years, and I have never taken apart a building where I didn't find evidence of building material reuse in that structure. We're talking about historic Savannah. It's a wonderful place. It's been a wonderful place since it was founded. Really significant and amazing buildings. There was also a lot of wealth there, so there wasn't necessarily a need for secondhand materials. And yet, even in fine homes, we see building material reuse. Why? Because it was just sensible. This is a wonderful property out in Vernonburg. Broke my heart to take this building apart. It often breaks my heart to do this work, but it was going to go to the landfill, so you better believe I got in there and saved every stick of it. And here in the roof, you can see used as studs, a bunch of old rafters. These are obviously rafters in the same house. They've got the bird mouth cut out of them. And then where those little rafter tails stuck out, they got painted more than once, as you can see. Same building, once we've had the finishes stripped off, and you can see even more evidence of building material reuse. Isn't this stunning? It looks like a painting. You can see the different colors of the wood, the different ages of the wood. You can see some of it's been painted, and some of these have been stained. Some of them had a rounded edge. They were probably baseboards. Some of them had notches taken out of them where they passed over a window opening. They might have been sheathing in a different building, but now they're sheathing in a different location. Evidence upon evidence. I could show you a zillion slides of this, but you'll have to come to another presentation of mine for those. All of this to say, not a new idea, and certainly not an outlandish one, something we can do, we have done, and we can continue to do. So how did we get here? The age of demolition. I said before, demolition's a bit of a newfangled idea. Anybody know how old demolition is? Without polling the class, I'll just give you the answer. It's less than 100 years old. Demolition was invented after World War II. That was 80 years ago, folks. And yet somehow this has become so ubiquitous in our public consciousness that we can't imagine doing anything differently. But believe it or not, the technology that we use to demolish our domestic environment was not invented to do this. It was invented for the war effort. In World War II, many of you will be familiar with the famous CBs, the engineering corps of the US Army, largely given credit with being one of the most significant factors in Allied victory in World War II. And the CBs specifically worked to facilitate the movement of tanks, troops, equipment, and supplies across the European theater. And this technology, the bulldozer, the excavator, these were invented to clear bombed out cities so that we could move through them after an attack. These were invented to clear the natural landscape to facilitate the movement of those products and humans across space. And then what did we do? Well, we won the war. Good job, CBs. A+, go Allies. And after the war, we had a new technology. We had the manufacturing capacity for this technology, and we had millions of young American men who'd been trained in the operation of this technology. So we brought them home, and we put them to work in the American landscape. And there's a couple of things you will realize are the direct result of this technology. The first being urban renewal, which was the largest scale clearance of any domestic landscape the human race had ever seen, which was clearing this idea that we could very quickly, efficiently, and cheaply get out with the old and in with the new. We also know that this work was done along heavily racial lines, along wealth and poverty lines, in a way that the legacy is still with us in association with demolition. Problematic, right? We also know that this technology directly resulted in the building of the US highway systems, right? Which, of course, Eisenhower, he was stressed after seeing how hard it was to move around Europe. Realizing how large America was, he wanted to build a highway system to ensure that if we were ever invaded, we could easily move tanks, troops, airplanes, and supplies across our own landscape. So we got to work tearing down America as fast as we could, and we haven't seen demolition at that scale until recent times, since urban renewal. And now we're in a period of the greatest clearance of the domestic environment, of course, again, in our history for the first time. I like to point that out because I think a lot of people don't realize just how short-sighted this methodology was. It was invented at a time when they couldn't possibly imagine running out of landfill space. And yet how quickly, because of how destructive, how short-sighted, and how non-circular, how linear take, make, waste this is, we very quickly, in the span of less than 100 years, reached the terminus. And we're now trying to handle the fallout of this relatively bad idea. And what does that fallout look like? Without belaboring the point made eloquently by so many of my friends here today, I'd just like to point out that construction and demolition generates more than twice the municipal solid waste across the country. And that means if you took the garbage generated by every American in a year and you put it in a big pile, that pile would be less than half the size of the pile that's generated by the construction and demolition industry alone. That's an issue. Roughly speaking, an American generates in their lifetime about the same amount of waste as you'd expect to see in an American house. So if you keep one house out of the landfill, you've offset the lifetime of an entire American. So I like to say, I'm in the clear, everybody on my team is in the clear, and now we got to work on absolving all of you all of your carbon impact, one building at a time. Globally speaking, reports are suggesting that C&D is responsible for a third of the world's waste. One industry alone. It is our single biggest contributor to waste. Time to work on this, folks. It is important to me to also talk about the public health aspect. It was mentioned earlier that one of the major drivers of policy in Portland, the first city in our country to have policy around deconstruction, one of the major drivers was the demolition dust and the noise. That dust is highly hazardous to our health. There have been countless studies about the negative health impacts of demolition dust. And in my city, we've dug in on the research on this to try to see who is the most affected. My city being Savannah, Georgia, reminds me a little bit of Nantucket in some ways, but in other ways, it's an incredibly different place. And we see that the vast majority of demolitions are occurring to historic buildings. That's 72% for the year here. That the vast majority of the population around those demolitions are low-income communities and communities of color. So now we know that those public health impacts are being borne by the most vulnerable people in our communities. And this should activate you immediately. It certainly activates me. We can look at other social impacts of the shift from deconstruction to demolition, namely fewer jobs. Now, we didn't see a reduction of the workforce when we saw a switch from about 6 jobs to 1 job, from deconstruction to demolition. What we saw was an increase in the demolition work. So we're talking about that demo boom, right, after World War II. And that increase in clearance, right, which had never been seen before on the surface of planet Earth, right, has gotten us to where we are in terms of workforce shifting. We're going to talk about workforce quite a bit here because I know we have our builders here with us and online, and I'd like to speak directly to you all because, as has also been said, y'all are the most important drivers of this change, and you're the ones who are actually going to be doing it. I should say we, because I'm here today with you in my steel toe boots, because I am going to San Antonio directly after here to do some more training with the beautiful folks who are digging in down there. And my suitcase is small, so steel toe boots it is. Mary did a great job talking about our mission a moment ago, and I'm just going to touch on it again. Now I'm going to talk about the repurpose model. We've talked about what has happened. We've talked about what needs to happen, and now let's talk about what is happening. This is where it gets exciting for me. We are looking at a climate-conscious solution for structural removal. We are looking at tying structural removal of historic buildings to best practices for historic preservation. These two things must, in my opinion, get tied together. Anytime that we're losing a historic building, those preservation best practices need to be foremost in our mind, right? Yeah, we can save the planet. We can also document our history, and we can do a lot more than that. We can train all kinds of folks to do this work. At Repurpose Savannah, our research and documentation looks like an archive on our website. I highly encourage you to visit repurposesavannah.org and go to our projects tab if you want to see some of the projects we've worked on. And not just see what they look like, learn all about them. You're going to know who lived there. You're going to know what they did. You're going to know what the industry in that neighborhood was. You're going to know if we can find out who the architect was. You're going to know what it was like for us to take that building apart. And you're going to know what products came out of that building and potentially, if we've done our job well, what they've become in their second life. We do our best to attach all of this information to every piece of salvage that comes out of our operation. We work with a number of local businesses to do this. We can't do everything on our own, and community is without a doubt the biggest factor in the success of a project like ours. Keep that in mind. Look around you. These are your friends. These are your allies. We're going to help you pull this off. So we work with Ethos Preservation. They do a deep dive in the history, and they find wonderful documents. Savannah is a very well documented place, as I'm sure Nantucket is as well. We have a deep history of preservation ideology, which means we can really find a lot of great stuff. So you can read all of that. You can see old plat maps and such to understand how our neighborhoods have evolved. We also work with a local company called Shamrock to do 3D scans of our buildings. We got to make sure that even once this building is gone, you can still walk through it. You can know what it felt like and what it looked like and how it sat on its site. I believe in this technology so much. This is what's called a dollhouse view, but you can zoom right in and walk through the structures. You'll be more familiar with this in terms of real estate. Folks in real estate are using this a lot now so that you can take tours of homes without having to go to them physically in person. Wonderful tool for research and for documentation of our historic buildings. But for me, I'm a junkie, as was said earlier. I'm a junkie about historic lumber and about historic building practices. I'm a nerd about traditional lumber milling. I'm a nerd about traditional craft. So when we have gotten it scanned and then we get to work cleaning out the interior, we get it scanned again so that you can walk through the building with all of the finishes stripped off. And you can learn, our students of preservation and our students of building can learn about how that building was built. You can interact with the materials. You can pinpoint where it is on that fluid timeline from timber frame to balloon frame to stick frame to modern construction. Every building is somewhere on that continuum, and I've never seen one that is clearly one or clearly the other. There are always these traces and overlaps. So every time we lose a historic structure, we're losing a lot of data about the history of the built environment, and I just can't have it. So we need to capture it twice to make sure that we know as much as we can. What's great also about this service is it's really economical for us. Not only do they produce these incredible walking tours of the structure, but they'll also produce facade drawing elevations. They'll produce floor plans, site maps for us. And these are robots that are doing this work. So it's highly affordable. It's wonderful for my clients. It doesn't add a lot to the cost of the removal of the building. And it's a way that we can contribute to the archive without having to, break the bank. Here's another example of some fine detail for one of our projects, or another one. This one actually we ended up being able to save because, it had a terrible fire, and everybody said it was a total loss. You know me, you'll know I don't think there's any such thing. So we got in to clean it up, and once all of the worst of the damage was out, the bones looked pretty good. So we got an engineer in there to say, yep, good to go, and the building got restored. Isn't that a happy story? That would not have happened if deconstruction didn't exist. That building would have just been demolished. So there it is, preservation folks. This is a benefit and this is a preservation practice. So very quickly, I know we've covered a lot of this stuff before. What do trees do? Man, they eat carbon. It's their job. They're real good at it. And then we make houses out of that. And then as they age and they fall into decline, we start to identify them as a risk or a liability, tragically. Not all of them are restored, unfortunately. And sometimes folks need to absolve themselves, or municipalities need to absolve themselves of this risk and liability. So what do? We put them in the landfill. Out of sight, out of mind, problem solved, right? Where, of course, they spit all that carbon back out into the atmosphere, which contributes to the intensity of storms, which contributes to the risk and liability of our declining building stock. However, this can be modified. It's a gentle tweak. What if when trees ate carbon and we made buildings out of them, and they started to fall into decline, we recognize that these are now assets for our community. And what do we do with assets? We certainly don't put them in the landfill, right? We steward them and we take excellent care of them and we bring them to bear to generate more for our community, right? We're going to invest in the future of these assets. So we're going to deconstruct this for materials. And this is, instead of spitting out carbon and methane and all kinds of nastiness, it's going to create other things. It's going to create jobs. It's going to create a product with an economic value. And it's going to create meaning in our community that's going to circulate over and over again. This is my favorite part. I like the squishy stuff. And I can tell you countless stories. Please come visit me in my lumber yard where I will bend your ear on the fascinating history of every stick of lumber in our large facility. These materials, of course, most importantly, can go back into the repair of our precious building stock and help keep more structures from being lost to decline. Historic building materials are, without a doubt, the best thing to use to repair your historic building. Anybody who works in old buildings will tell you such. So let's save it so we can use it to save more buildings standing and lose fewer of them to the landfill. Guess what? This also has a major benefit for us in terms of resilience. You guys are probably really a lot more familiar with that term here in Nantucket than a lot of people are. This is a place that has been focused on resilience for a long time, and that's really impressive and very cool. But in Savannah, we experienced this in a really primary sense during the pandemic. There was a lumber crisis. I'm not sure how it affected you here. Was it bad? Yeah, man, it was bad in Georgia too. It was really bad. The crummy 2x4 from Home Depot that usually costs you $3 costs you $20, and nobody wants to buy a crummy 2x4 for $20. We, on the other hand, because if I don't know about up here, but there was definitely a building and demolition boom that coincided with COVID, right? So we were up to our ears in work. We had more work than we could handle. In fact, we still have more work than we can handle. I'm working really hard to try to cross-train other teams in Savannah to keep up with the demand for deconstruction services. So what that meant was that we had more supply than we'd ever seen. And while the price of your crummy lumber went through the roof, our prices stayed exactly the same. So when you're looking at a crummy 2x4 versus something that is incredibly solid, historic, old growth timber that stood in perfect condition in a house for 150 years and is still in better condition than that new one you were just going to buy at Home Depot. And when that price is pretty similar, a lot of folks came over to our place and were converts of historic lumber. It also meant that we had a resource in a time of crisis that other places who didn't have a circular economy did not have. We were very proud to be able to service our community and keep all those homes in great repair in a time when the larger infrastructure couldn't satisfy their local community needs. This is something we should all take really seriously. Instead of a pile of rubble at the end of a demolition, you can start to see the real value in this work when you're interacting with these products. This is just a tiny, tiny taste of the kind of products that we have available at our facility. You wouldn't believe how much timber there is in a historic building. If you build buildings for a living, you probably know about it. But until you've handled every stick of lumber in a building, you just can't imagine the volume of what is being lost when we only focus on our architectural finishes. Doors and windows are lovely. I love them and we save them. But for me, it's about the lumber. The floors are easy to sell. The timbers are harder, but we've been really successful at building that market. Building the market is the harder part of this equation, but it can be done. We're only 5 years old, and we have grown significantly. I've been in charge for 4 years. We have a team of 12 people. Everybody makes a living wage, and we do better year over year. We're looking at a target budget of about $850,000 this year. We were 20 grand in debt 4 years ago. So that is really rapid growth, and that's in Georgia, where the economy looks a little different than it does maybe up here in New England. All this product has a real value, not only a monetary value and not only a structural value, but a cultural value, something that we take really seriously. When you buy a piece of salvage from Repurpose Savannah, you're going to get a receipt in your email because we don't print on paper, sustainability. And in that receipt, there's going to be a link to those research pages that I showed you on our website of the house that every single piece of that salvage came out of. So not only do you now have this beautiful, high-quality, affordable material that you can reuse in your home, but you've connected to the history and the past of it. You can share it with your friends, tell those stories over and over again. And the great news, of course, is that instead of sending my money to the landfill as a business owner, and instead of paying a lot of money for maintenance and fuel of machines, I get to give my money to my staff. Deconstruction is about 6 times more labor than demolition. And when it comes down to my community as a small business owner, I'm a nonprofit owner, but we really operate like a small business. I am way more interested in paying my community, spending that money on some humans than I am in sending it to the landfill. And I need to tell you guys, we're able to keep 75 to 95% of our buildings out of the dump. Those of you who work in demolition, you'll know that the bulk of your cost is going to be tipping fees. And that's in Georgia. Here, it's a totally different ballpark. The cost to demolish up here, man, wow. We could do a lot with the kind of budgets that y'all are spending to put all of this in the trash. We could do a lot of good for our communities, and we can build a really powerful workforce, really meaningful, rewarding jobs, and keep that money circulating in the hands of our residents here on Nantucket. We can do this across the country. Without repeating my friends who went before me, of course, Portland being the first city in our country to pass policy, and there are a couple of things we can learn from what's gone on there. Believe it or not, fewer historic buildings are now demolished in Portland, and that's due to a number of reasons. Number one, it takes a little longer. So not only will people do the right thing if you make it easier, they'll also not do the wrong thing if you make that harder. So taking longer to take an old building apart sometimes is enough to convince a person to just restore it instead. And believe it or not, gosh, what an impact that's made, and what a great selling point to our friends in preservation who are worried that getting behind deconstruction as a preservation practice is going to culminate in the loss of more historic buildings. We've actually seen the opposite. More historic buildings are staying in repair. The second factor, of course, being the abundance of appropriate materials to keep those historic buildings in repair. This is important for our workforce people here. In more than 50% of the deconstructions in Portland, additional hazardous materials have been discovered in the course of that decon. So what that means is, if that building had lead and asbestos in it before it was taken down, and that material was abated, in the course of taking the building apart, more of it was found, and they were able to go in and abate that. But if that had been demolished, what we're saying is, even if all demolitions are properly abated, which we know they're not, but even if they were, half of those still have more harmful asbestos in them after the fact, and we are still, we're spreading that all over our neighbors, and I'm not into that personally. What's so great about places that are finding success through deconstruction policy is that we're able to save more and more buildings over time. In the original expression of the policy in Portland, it was buildings built 1915 or before, and it's been so successful that they've now bumped it up to 1940. They're doing the same thing in San Antonio. I can't remember the exact dates, but they've started with, I believe it's 1920 and older, and now they're already looking at moving forward to 1940 and older, keeping more of their beautiful heritage materials. And I gotta tell you, they're gorgeous in Texas, very different than what we're dealing with in Georgia, but beautiful, keeping it out of the dump and giving it back to the community to use for all number of expressions. So of course, we're seeing this all over the country. Palo Alto has a 100% demolition ban. It is a small community, much like Savannah or Nantucket. Small communities really do have the power sometimes to affect a lot more change than bigger communities. Really exciting to see. And I like to point out at this point as well that every community's needs are very different. Of course, we know that because of our other presentations here today. Your policy is going to look different than any policy that's been successful anywhere else. Do take the time to make sure that you're custom tailoring this for your own needs. San Antonio, Texas, of course, 7th largest city in the country. And boy, if they can do it in Texas, we can sure do it, right? Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We've got people working in Ithaca, New York on policy, people in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Nantucket, and of course, we are working on this in Savannah, Georgia. We decided after feasibility studies in the state of Georgia that leading with the stick, as it were, wasn't going to work. We needed to lead with the carrot. So we're taking the carrot approach. We are proving the model. We are building the infrastructure. We're making it work in an economically viable and replicable way so that then we can follow up with policy. Because, Georgia is one of the cheapest states to landfill in the nation. Demolition is fast, cheap, and easy. Labor costs are low. So if we can do it, again, if we can do it in Georgia in a way that's still profitable and we're able to create quality of life for our staff, benefit our communities, save our historic heritage, surely we can do this in other places as well. I work with a small group, Savannah Decom Policy Coalition. We have some materials I'd be glad to share for your efforts, but we've also gotten a little creative. As I said, we're not going with the stick, we're leading with the carrot. So we're trying to be creative about ways to ramp up towards something like a policy or an overarching ordinance. Some of the successes we have had already with our local government are now in Savannah, if you want to apply for a demolition permit for a building of a certain age, regardless of whether or not it's in a protected district, you have to document that building, and you have to submit that documentation as a gift to the archive before you get your permit to remove the structure. This is amazing. This is a great leap forward. It was spearheaded by our Office of Municipal Archives, who were inspired by the work that we do, and they thought, shoot, why can't we require this? And it turns out we can. Something else we've had great success with is working with our local commissions to put conditional approval on the demolitions of any buildings within a historic district. And what that means is, in the rare case that a historic building is approved for demolition, It's actually not approved for demolition. It's approved for removal on the condition that you hire a salvage company to deconstruct and reuse that material. That's been incredibly helpful. It is, of course, subject to turnover in the commission, so we hope that we are able to maintain our allies there and keep more of these beautiful properties out of the landfill. But until of course we're able to put in place something that is a lot stronger, something like a city ordinance that could protect every historic building from going to the dump where it does not belong. This work is different than demolition. It is lovely, if I may say so myself. I'm a little obsessed with it. Once you've taken a building apart by hand, it's like the best puzzle you've ever done, and it's highly addictive. It's very clean work. It's very dignified work. It's a lot more like construction or a lot more like archaeology than it is like demolition. It couldn't be more different from demolition. Our job sites are immaculate. They're as clean as a new build. That's because we've spent the first week cleaning the building, especially in the cases when they're a little dirty, which sometimes they are. It's careful, it's respectful. We like to think about this as a way to pay homage and to honor the building even in its decline. And we can often think about these buildings almost like organ donors to go help keep other buildings in excellent health into the future. It's also deeply satisfying work. I find it very rewarding. My team finds it very rewarding. And as such, I wish I could hire all the people who are clamoring for jobs to come and work with us. I get resumes in my inbox all the time, and I don't have the budget to hire them all. And I gotta say, I feel like folks could really benefit. People want to talk a lot about the labor crisis in the construction industry, and I really just don't buy it. I think we have more of an access crisis. I think it's about throwing the doors to this wonderful industry open. Construction is a really rewarding industry to work in. They get really good jobs. You got good benefits, hopefully, and a lot of folks, I think, would like to gain access to these careers. We got to work at breaking down the barriers that exist, particularly for women, half of the workforce, y'all. And a lot of people want to tell me that women don't want to do this work. That's just not true. Women are, in fact, excellent at this work. My whole company is full of them, and we're very good at what we do. Enough? Thank you. This is also an opportunity to build community. We have school students out to our decon sites all the time. We're always working with local universities. We're working with the trade schools. In fact, I'm very proud to announce that we are hopefully in final stages of approval with the Department of Labor on the very first registered apprenticeship program for deconstruction of historic properties. This is becoming recognized as a traditional historic trade and recognized as a skill that what this will mean is that anyone across the country who wants to run a deconstruction training program can follow this curriculum. It's approved by the Department of Labor. It puts you in line for funding for registered apprenticeship programs, which is a huge reason why we've done this in the first place, because that will help us a great deal and help grow the industry. We need to normalize deconstruction and help this become the only way to handle, particularly our oldest buildings. And with this success, I hope we'll come to see it as the solution for all of our buildings. Ultimately, of course, the goal being to replace this, which after all this talk today, I hope looks fairly barbaric, right? We're looking to replace this with something that looks more like this. This is my team working on the house I showed you in the beginning with the beautiful stripes, and also like this. Our reuse facility is my pride and joy. It has been, without a doubt, the harder thing. Taking a building apart is challenging, but it is not rocket science. You need to be trained, you need to be safe, you need to learn your safety best practices. At the end of the day, the work to create a healthy, strong reuse market and a facility that can support the cycling of those materials in the community turns out to be way harder, but we have made an incredible strides in that direction, and I'd love to help this community and many communities across the country avoid making so many of the mistakes that we have made and that we have learned from over the years and end up with a tight, tidy, beautiful facility. Salvage yards don't always need to be junky. It can look like this. It can look like humans and not machines. It can look like training and opportunities. It can look like education. It can look like the marrying of sustainability, historic preservation, and construction. And I believe this is the way forward. So I look forward to answering any of your questions as I watch this community move in the direction of deconstruction and reuse. Thank you so much.
Oh, I just want to make one announcement, just to say that obviously we're not going to have time for all of our little breakout groups. But if you look at the back of your program, there's a QR code that'll take you to a survey. We really love to hear, your thoughts about what do you think could work on Nantucket? What are you afraid of? What questions do you want answered? And I'm hoping that you can ask May some of your questions now. If you have questions for anybody else, you do have to leave the museum at 6. So please take food on your way out.
Oh, I went long.
No, everybody did. It's okay. We all did. It's very exciting stuff. So I'm going to stop. You can ask May your questions, but please take some food as you leave.
Is there a deconstruction program in Charleston?
Not yet. No, believe it or not. Most of the wonderful historic cities of the Southeast do not have deconstruction going on. We were the first in Savannah. You wouldn't think so, right? All those beautiful historic buildings, they were all just going to the dump until we got in there and stopped it. So I have a lot of friends at the College of Building Arts in Charleston, and we're hoping to get started up there pretty much as soon as possible.
First of all, thank you. And I hope that we're all inspired to do more of this on Nantucket. But my question is, have you reached out to some of these HGTV filming to see if you can work with them, because that would inspire people?
Well, I haven't spoken with HGTV, but I will tell you, we did just get interviewed by CBS Evening News, which was terrifying. I don't know when it's going to air, but we should be on the national news relatively soon, and hoping that we do inspire people to get involved all across the country. So wish me luck. I hope I didn't sound like a dummy. It's pretty scary. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? I wish there are so many aspects of this I'd love to do a deep dive on. I'd love to talk about the economics of this. If anybody is in the industry and wants to talk about how this actually works in terms of dollars and cents, catch me after. I love to answer these questions.
But the step that people in Savannah, you don't have an ordinance
No.
deconstruction. So what's the step that they come, or you go to them?
Oh no, I don't have to do
Does
any.
someone come to you?
They come to us. Like I said, we are flooded with requests for deconstruction. We have a long list, and we have to try to catch as many as we can. I can't catch them all. The demand for this service is extreme. I will
Wasn't
tell you.
at the beginning, was it?
It happened pretty quick. I'm not gonna lie.
That's great.
We try to be very visible. We work really heavily on social media. Follow us on Instagram at Repurpose Savannah. We like to invite people into this work because we think it's really important for folks to see and understand what it actually is, see the care and the carefulness that we're demonstrating. And so I think the result of that visibility was that a lot of people were just like, heck, I've got this old building. I feel really crummy about the fact that I can't keep it up, but I don't want to tear it down. Here's a solution for me. And they started coming out of the woodwork, no pun intended. And like I said, I need to train other outfits to help me absorb the demand for this service. Not only is it a wonderful way to be respectful and gentle to your historic building, even while losing it, it is also a green product. As we know, the demand for green solutions is only growing. Folks want to be able to do the right thing if we make it easy. Yes.
This is sort of a technical question, but in your deconstruction process, how do you deal with the safety codes, especially with like lead remediation? For instance, Massachusetts, carpenters can't even touch a lead doorway, a casing or anything like that without being a lead licensed remediator.
Well, we are very careful. Safety is our primary concern. You go on our job sites and you're going to see every bit, probably more than, especially in Georgia, of what you're going to see in our contemporaries throughout the industry. Everybody's wearing fall protection. Everybody's wearing lead-rated respirators, gloves, eye goggles, earplugs, hard hats, high-vis. We take it really seriously. The code for whether or not you can touch lead in Georgia is different than in Massachusetts. So as long as we're wearing lead-safe respirators, we can handle it, but we don't disturb it. We also respect the lead. We're not trying to shake it up. We're not trying to sand it or clean it off. When we do rehome materials that are covered in lead, we disclaimer it. We inform and educate our customers, make sure that they know what they're handling. We're not trying to be irresponsible with it. It does have to go state by state when it comes to those regulations. But I'll tell you one thing that we don't play with is asbestos. We get every project abated. And then in the case when we do find additional asbestos material, we get somebody else in there to abate it. So just like with renovation and restoration, people are going to ask those same questions of people that are trying to restore and renovate historic buildings. It's the same approach. Just be smart, take care of your people, protect your people, be safe, be trained. Yeah? All right. Thank you. All right, folks. Oh, we got one more.
We have one more.
Okay, and then I'm going to make you take Mary's food.
So you mentioned the economics of it. When someone approaches you, do you give them, like you say, I'm going to do that for $50,000, or how do you price?
Yeah, it's going to be somewhere in there. I take into consideration a lot of factors. I take into consideration the economic realities of my clients. We're in the deep south. Some folks really can't afford even a demolition. I am a sucker for an old building, so I'm probably going to try to find a way to make it work. And I can do that because we are competitive in turning a margin on most of our jobs. So in the case that I need to, reduce my price a little, I'm turning a margin on just the decon. Right? So if my contracts are turning a margin, I am still gaining all of that material asset, which I can then sell to help support my nonprofit. There is a cost associated with processing and bringing those goods to market, for sure, but there's still a margin there at the end of the day. So the first thing I'm going to do is, at this point, I can kind of eyeball it because I've been doing this for a long time, but I'm going to say, what's the cost of conventional demolition, right? So it's probably going to cost you about the same. I'm going to shoot to get as close to that as I possibly can. In some cases, deconstruction does cost a lot more. For example, brick. Wow. Brick is a challenge. It's also a thrill I look forward to. I could bend your ear about all the ways we're trying to get creative with brick. But at the end of the day, sometimes the deciding factor does come down to the fact that I'm a nonprofit and we can offer tax incentives. However, if you are not a nonprofit and you are not the material hub, I speak directly to you contractors, right? You don't have to be a nonprofit for that homeowner to get a tax deduction to work on this job. So even if you're charging 20% more than a conventional demolition, they're still going to get a tax deduction that's going to wipe out that overage. You're going to make more money. They're going to save more money, as long as those materials get donated to a nonprofit, which is often your reuse material hub, right? In most communities, that's what we're seeing. Number one is nonprofit model. Number two, of course, being the city. And cities can come up with alternative incentives to make that math work as well. The numbers can work, believe it or not. It's the biggest myth about decon is that it can't. And as was said also before, places that have been doing this for a long time, the cost has been coming down. It's an emerging industry. Emerging industries almost always start out a little high on the end, on the price point. Give us some time to practice. We've already gotten significantly better at this in the 5 years we've been doing it, and the whole industry will continue to do that as well. Okay, time to grab some food, folks. Thank you for your time.